Well, we have a very unusual church here that began in 1790. And just the fact it started that early and under the presidency of George Washington is a very unusual thing. One of the things that we're well known for, too, is that letter that was written to Thomas Jefferson from the Danbury Baptists, 1801 and 1802. I'll give you a little background behind that. Early on, in the colonies, there was a lot of persecution of the Baptists. They were throwing them in jail. Isaac Backus was one of them, actually. He was a pastor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Isaac Backus was thrown into prison because he would not pay taxes to the state. And in this case, the taxes were going to the Congregational Church. So there was a problem there between what we call separation of church and state. In 1791, that was a year after our church actually was born, the First Amendment that we're so familiar with was added to our Constitution. And of course, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the churches were excited about that. That was wonderful. Those who valued freedom of speech, as the Baptists did, and there were others who did, but we uniquely as Baptists, one of our primary things is freedom of religion. And, the ability to be able to follow your conscience. And sometimes that means some people don't decide not to believe in a God at all. That is their freedom to do that. Now, I'm going to preach against it, and that's fine. That's my freedom as far as, freedom of speech is concerned. But I have no right to tell them that they must believe exactly the way I do. And of course, that's kind of what was going on in the colonies, and that was a problem when they threw Isaac Backus into prison. But 1801, or 1800 rather, Thomas Jefferson became president of the United States. And the Danbury Baptist Association, which consisted of 27 different churches at that time, they were very excited to have him as president, but they were very concerned. They were concerned with some of their brethren who had been persecuted. Again, I mentioned Isaac Backus in Massachusetts, but there were other things as well. In fact, at the meeting in Colebrook, Connecticut, October the 7th, 1801, there was and this was a meeting of those 27 different churches. And this is the meeting before they decided, or at that meeting, they decided to send a letter to Thomas Jefferson with their concerns because they were being persecuted for their religious belief in a separation of church and state. And so they were addressing at the meeting a query from the Simsbury, Connecticut church concerning religious discrimination. And the following is an excerpt from the minutes of that meeting. Query from the church in Simsbury: is it the duty of a dissenter to acknowledge the right of civil government dictating in matters of religion so far as to give a certificate to the clerk of a Presbyterian society what religion they are of? And the answer that was given at that meeting: we are of the opinion that it is oppression for one society to require certificates of another. But whether God requires us at this time to say, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did in another case, be it known to thee, O king, we will not. We leave for the present for individuals to judge and determine for themselves as they can answer it to God. And voted that, and the point afterwards says, in those Colebrook notes, voted that elders Royce, Wildman, Dodge, Nelson, and Deacons Mills and Robbins be a committee to prepare an address to the President of the United States in behalf of this association. So, there we have seen, what was all of that about? What, was it God is the separation of church and state a prohibition to remove God from government. It was never intended to be that way. And the Colebrook notes show us that. It was intended to the separation of church and state. It is a biblical principle, not a governmental principle alone. It's a biblical principle. And the separation of church and state involves not having an official church state, not having, the church controlling state, what they are to do, or to have an official state religion. It was not to keep God out of government, but it was to keep the government out of the church. In fact, we look at our early documents in our country. We look at the buildings with some of the Bible verses and sayings that are on the outside, even the Capitol. There is an interesting saying in there that reflects a belief in the second coming of Jesus Christ. So all over our country, all over our ancient, older documents, we have documents that confesses that they believed in God. So to say we need to keep God out of government, as back in the 40s the Supreme Court in essence said, is not true. It's not true at all. So our founding fathers never wanted to keep God out of government, but there was a concern that there not be an established state church as there was, as the countries they came from when they came to the United States, for instance, in England. That's why they left England, because of the persecution of Christians there. By the way, in referring to what Jefferson said, Jefferson in that document, in that letter that he wrote back to the Danbury Baptists, 1801, the Danbury Baptists wrote to him with their concerns. Jefferson wrote back to the Danbury Baptists, assuring them that their religious liberty would be supported. And in that, he uses the term wall of separation. People believe that, separation of church and state, that's in our Constitution. No, it's not. It's not in our Constitution. But it is in the document, the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote back to the Danbury Baptists. And it's interesting because that statement, wall of separation, Jefferson was borrowing a metaphor of a man by the name of Roger Williams, who was a pastor in what is today Rhode Island. And he was a fellow Baptist. In fact, he planted the very first Baptist church in the United States. He was a champion of religious freedom in Rhode Island. And Williams had previously written of, quote, a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. So Jefferson was simply quoting, or at least alluding to what Roger Williams had said before, and was supporting the Baptists at that time and what they held to be true from the Word of God.